I'll be talking about deafness. Deafness is pretty common in the United States. Just about maybe 1 in 6 children are deaf, whether they're born or they acquired being or having being deaf. Um, there's not really a cure to it. It just depends on your severity of your hearing issues. For example, if you just need a slight hearing aid, they'll put hearing aids and you can still hear and you can still communicate. Or all the way to the spectrum of you just can't hear at all. You don't hear frequencies, you don't hear sound waves, you don't hear anything. You're just completely deaf. So there's not really a cure. There are things they can do depending on your severity. Characteristics. Typically in a young child, a characteristic of deafness is they just don't respond when you call to them. Like if you would try calling their name or telling them to do something, they may act like they're ignoring you, but maybe they just don't hear what you're saying. Another thing is, depending on the severity, it could also be the fact that they need hearing aids to help them hear. They may hear you, but they may not respond, or they hear what you're saying, but they can't quite connect it all together. The most challenging part of having this disability for being a child would probably be just not being able to communicate properly, because if the child wants to communicate, depending on the severity, they can either use other terms or they just don't communicate at all. A lot of times children will try to write down what they want to say, or the parent can have them learn sign language, which is the most effective way to learn. It's probably a challenging part because they can't communicate properly, they can't get across their emotions, they can't understand what's going on around them. Teachers, if you were to put your child in a public school, the teacher's best meet of the child would probably have an interpreter in the classroom, because if the child is completely deaf, there's no way the child can learn unless it has an interpreter. Let's say the school can't afford an interpreter or have one on site. The teacher can try editing their lesson so it's more of a visual lesson, or maybe be PowerPoint, or they write down a lot of stuff on the projector so the child can read what the teacher wants you to do. Or the teacher can just have the lesson plan and then completely make a new one, but of the same content for the child. So, for example, depending on what grade, the teacher can make a booklet or a packet with all the written out instructions and pictures and stuff to do, and the child can just go reading it or looking at the pictures and they'll know what to do. I feel like deafness should be covered under the IDEA because the IDEA is a program that helps parents and students give the rights to their child of a learning disability. And deafness is a learning disability. It's not only just not being able to hear, but it's also because a lot more things. Like, not only can your child not hear, but they can't speak. Depending whether your child was born deaf, they may have a hard time learning the English language because they don't know it. They haven't experienced it before. They're just completely non-existent to sound. So they'd have to learn sign language in order to communicate. But if your child learned the English language, and then became deaf, like they got into a car accident and became deaf because of a head injury, it would be somewhat easy for them to communicate because they know the language and they know what they want to say. But for the person they're communicating with to communicate back would be difficult because they can't hear what they're saying. Even though they may know the language, they don't know how to respond because the person they're talking to can't relate. So I feel like it should be covered under the IDEA because it's a big issue. The child can't learn, the child is considered mute, and they would need serious rearranging in order to learn right. Unless you put your child in a deaf school where it's a school just for those with hearing impairments. What are your rights as a parent when it comes to making sure the school and teachers are providing necessary supplies and meeting your child's needs? You have a lot of rights. When it comes to being deaf, you have a lot of rights. You can have the right to have an interpreter in the classroom at all times. You have the right as a parent to be in the classroom at all times with your child. You have the right to see if your child can be tested to see if they have a hearing issue. You have the right to pursue a court session if you feel like your child is being not treated properly. You have the right as a parent to just make sure your child gets the learning they need, whether you put them in a public school or in a deaf school. You still have the right because the child is having a hard time learning.